Imagine upon the highway, you see some youth flash past you. Because upon the highway, it not say 80 miles per hour, you know. It say 80 kilometers. Now, true, a whole heap of one no use a kilometer and miles. Them just drive, how them want to drive. Them no business if it say 80 kilometers. Them are gone at 120. 120. Come this man pass me already. And me a drive 85, 90. And the way him pass me know him gone over 120. Me nah drive pan no road at 120. Me nah drive that way there. I mean 120 kilometers. I don't business if it's a highway. Him have to let me out. Me will take my chance with the gunman.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you all are doing good. Hope you all are doing great. So your boy here come across this one. We are in a terrible accident collision on the highway, included the most expensive vehicle in a Jamaica. Yeah. But the greatest thing, nobody no dead. Nobody no get terrible injury. Plus, guys, you will be also hearing from Mutabaruka attacking a lot in this one. So my people, this one is gonna be really a warm one. So you wanna stay tuned and don't forget, I'm here on the Black Unity program. So feel free to leave a like and subscribe to this channel if you're new. With that being said, let's go ahead and hear what's taking place in a Jamaica. Yeah. Fully active out.
Do we have to
Bobby, mingle and let them through the middle and come. Come here, follow behind you.
But the people are like that, and you
No, we don't get touched. We unite up. No, we don't get touched. We unite a prayer, so no me then touch me. Come me just see them a phone.
You see the chair fall over, you know? You see chair, no. See, you see chair.
Where's the miss? Where's it?
They forget lock up.
And we get locked up?
Yes. Sir.
Why?
Because I'm a drive too past a funeral where I come from a past the wall of them.
So who passed you first? Who passed you?
When the car, the white one there, one I saw. Come back and show you.
Oh, judge.
No man, serious star. All them boys are run man and get locked up. Come at their backers me name. My name is Backers. Backers name. Where white one there? Where white one there with a pass? Where white first white one there?
Judge.
Right there, see there. That one now. That one now. That one now.
Judge.
Yeah, I eat that, sir. I eat that thing that. Right now, me can't go my yard.
Yo, Bill. Bombok. Yo.
I just I'm a no safe. Do we have to
Bobby, mingle and let them through the middle and come. Come here, follow behind you.
but the people are like that, and you
Bombok. Yo.
I just I'm a no safe. Do we have to?
Bobby, mingle let them through the middle, me come. Come here, follow behind you.
But the people are like, yeah, they're doing it.
Never wanted to be this Can I report at transportation just time. Yo, baby, come.
What is happening? Boom, boom, and flash past everybody. When you drive go down on the other part of the road, the man drive the Mercedes Benz over the railing them. Drive the Mercedes Benz the way my drive far. I don't know where the hell him can go. It's like him here to the road I go locked down. Then the next day now, we hear apparently the man must have a bad tire for him van. I go through Fern Gully. That me I wonder now, how a car can crash in a Fern Gully and kill people. Whether it have a bad tire or not, but at what speed was he driving through Fern Gully? That film tire bust out. And it kill people and mash up people, Rasta. Me don't understand that. And then day before, yes, I went the one away, the one, you know. 3 car mash up at Ochi. Three of them crash, mash up. 3 people dead. 3 people dead. I don't know if some of them people can drive really, you know, a car or a coaster. And all them a driver, him a blow him hand. Why you drive and a blow your hand straight? What that good for? And then the wickedest one now is that me here say in June the said weekend, yeah, in a Portland, a man and him 2 picnic in a car and him come out and another man lick him. And the father and one of the people them dead. The other one gone to hospital. It's where go on, it's where I go on. Me tell Olney self to just dig up back the road. I tell Olney to dig up back the road, you know, Rasta. Because I come like, oh nigga, no use so smooth road. One to the camera them, where them supposed to have on the road. Them don't have no camera upon them highway and byways and all them places. Them need some camera, Rasta. Because you see England, I mean, I compare England with Jamaica, you know, but you can't drive any little distance and van and camera no pick you up, you know. Me and my brethren, them are driving and them know exactly where the camera them left to slow down, you know. You see, for them pass the camera, gone like lightning, and me at the brethren. And a plane me go catch in your yard, me go. America, a man I drive, no care if him come from Jamaica, if him come from the deepest part of Jamaica when I have no stoplight. You see, from him see a stoplight, even if it say yellow, him go and go stop and wait till it say green. When them say, in England, you depend on highway and them say 20 miles per hour. And them ride it at the middle of the road, you know. Them ride how much miles you must supposed to go in at the middle of the road. And some highway, what we call highway, them ride that, you know, 20 miles per hour. You think any Jamaican I go drive on one of them road there and see it mark 20 miles per hour and keep 20 miles per and keep 50 miles per hour. Them need some camera, Rasta. Camera. Government must invest in some camera upon the road. Not just which part the toll booth there, where they might tell you how much money you're supposed to pay. And who, which car come there, so. What kind of car. It's crazy. It's crazy, man. Car now, this is what I will put all high and each up in some dump. Pure old car mash up. And nowadays I pure new car I see on the road. All of them car that we are crashing, you know, and a whole car, you know. Like all the Benz there, like all the Land Rover. A Land Rover, them call them a Range Rover. Them car, a kind of newish kind of car. And then the people, them dead. We can't tell the driver them say ease up. Because it don't make no sense. Them not listen. Because every man feels say, the other man go crash, him not crash. Every man feel that when him drive. Him say, oh, them man they that, them can't drive, you know. And him drive some way upon the road, I drive on the right hand side of the road. And that him do, him drive on the right hand side of the road. I say, but wait. I'm more than 1 week I talk about this car driving business, the coaster bus, them and they might come off all the Red Girl Ring Road, so, and I go down Long Lane, so. And they might drive like it's a one way. You live on the highway, I see some youth flash past you. Some youth, I don't know. Some youth flash past by them recognize me. And them slow down up at the top of the road. Just to say if I really me. And when my car then near to them, they start drive with my car. And I say, what, Mutabaruka? I say, Bridget, look on where you go, man. A highway there, pan. Look on where you go. Them no business. Them love them life, you know, but them don't want to live them life. Them love them life. I can't say nobody don't love them life. Most people love them life, but them don't want to live them life. And right now, we're reaching a stage where it get wicked. Every day I buy crash. The other day I come home 12 in the night. And when we reach up at the top of the road, I pass Golden Spring. I see a long line of traffic. I say, where I go on up there. So them say, what you want to say? They might try pull out a car from under that truck, you know. A long time we there, you know. Then we realize, I'm doing it far from the yard, you know. And me and Jackie, I say, you know something? I go get to a hotel here, Rasta, and get up early, man, and come up here. Because when they must send me for go drive, go way around, go way up a Lawrence stuff around and come back down and all them way there. But never let them think they not make like the night there. And when we go drive off, we see the man run, come down and I say, hey, them put him out, them pull him out. Same place with 5 youth crash. Same place, 5 youth dead. A ride come up the road like them are mad people, like a one way. Same place with 2 youth crash, same bike man them. And them no business, them business, you know. But them not things say them are going to crash. Most time, when you see a man drive on the highway and him a speed, you know, him not things say him going to crash. But him don't know say a man can make a wrong move and make him crash. You know, see it? Meanwhile, him thinks say him not crash and another man going to make a wrong move. And the problem with it is that the nether man nah go dead. And him go dead. Because more than likely the man who make a move, him did that drive slow, and show him see the person that drive slow in front time, him decides him go speed up and overtake the man. And when him overtake and swing out, for go swing back in, him can't go down skid, boof, lift up on the partition of the road. See him carry spin over and go over there so. Then they will see a man crash and a pure fire engulf from car and van. And the man a roll upon the dirt. A roll. forget rid of the fire. It's when him get up, him look like a dundus. When you look at him skin, it look like a dundus. I don't know where him they know. How him going to manage with that the skin. It have to get all sort of thing. And the problem with it is that even though you are drive careful and I drive careful, you always have a mad guy where it just so terrible that he will lick you. He will lick your car. And then so it's like the bike man them. Most of the people them who dead pan bike are the pillion them, you know. Most of the people them who dead pan bike back are pillion. All the daughter were dead the other day. You can just imagine how she go buy a part this and buy a part that and a holiday time and she go jump on bike now go out. Things stay away, Rasta. Things really, really stay away. One more thing and come off of this. You know, I feel with them people who are drive them new car, yeah? When them say 80 kilometer, them not see it as kilometer. Them see it as 80 miles per hour. But you know when you drive 80 miles per hour, you know. Because on the highway, it not say 80 miles per hour, you know. It say 80 kilometer. Now, true, a whole heap of one no use the kilometer and miles. Them just drive, how them want drive. Them no business if it say 80 kilometer. Them are gone at 120. 120. Come see man pass me already. And me I drive 85, 90. And the way him pass me know him gone over 120. Me not drive pan no road at 120. Me not drive that way there. And anyhow, me see a man a drive that way there with me on a road, 120 miles. 120 kilometers. I don't business if it's a highway. He have to let me out. Me will take my chance with the gunman. Because sometimes you can't talk to them gunman there. Let me out. Even if me up on the highway, make me walk and stand up there and bum lift. Nobody that left me a road. All I have to do is hold out my foot. Him say, wait a motor that you don't see him foot there and just go with me. So, it's a thing. It's weird, man. It's weird. We'll take a break and come forward. So there with you up on the stepping razor. Man just WhatsApp me a while ago and tell me, say, the only person who survived in that crash with the fire and the man who did that roll upon the ground. Wow. Him say, somebody say, I'm the only one who survived. Everybody in the car dead. What a judgment. Trial and crosses. And a whole heap of people that say trial and crosses have reached them, you know. Yeah, man. Some people go all over the place to go find solace in them trial and crosses. And not realize that sometimes they have to looking at themselves. Where a man can't work some of the time, you know, and they ring them where you have on your finger, where you call, where them call it ring. You know, it can't work. You know, see, you have to go in on yourself, man. What you're going on with in yourself. What is the demon that you have in you? When you drive them way up on the road, because you want to reach down a Constant Spring or reach down halfway tree before the other man with the behind you. Sometimes them block the other man, you know, and through them block the man behind them. Them block up all the car them with the behind the other man. And them now check that. Oh, me never see a me drive and see all the thing. I never see a policeman stop one of them man there yet. I mean, I say them not stop them, you know. But me see it so much time that me I say, oh, what does me want to see them thing here? And my trial and cross is that I me want to see. Say the man them a drive like madman and idiot on the road. Me not see no policeman in all of the hot spot them with them things that go on. No policeman at all. And when you reach down in the town area, you see the whole of them on them cell phone. The police them may attack. Stand up then and look on them cell phone and I look man and all them way there. Look how much madness are going on the road, Rasta. Look how the man them a drive. How did that day last year, a year before last, we see government send out press release all to me and them send it. For read out. If you get caught with that, without license, without registration, $20,000, without this, that, if you make a wrong move, this and that, if you broke a stoplight, this and that. Where all them little la, we want to set down. Me no see it at work. Because me no see no difference. Because it's supposed to make a difference in the attitude and the behavior of the driver them. I mean, see more people right now are drive terrible. It's like the man them just dare the government to say, well, I bet you so we just drive same way and you can't do nothing. You know, see it. The amount of bad driving, I know say no me want to experience it. Because I put myself in the way to experience bad drivers. Because most of the time when I get bad riding, I become in a line of traffic. A man there at a stoplight. And it says stop. And a string of car stop. And as the light go yellow, you see a taxi man just fly around the whole of the car and just gone past the stoplight. And when you go down the way, you don't see no police. We don't understand them something there. We don't understand that. But all of them law where them did put down. Them love put down law and not administrate the law and not set the law in motion. That's why you have so much generalship and scamming go on. Monks, the people them in authority, me attack. Because them not instinct, them not make the thing work continuously. Anyway, we see some turn of events are going in a Libya there. Them will appear, apparently them get out Gaddafi, them a try find him now, them say £1.5 million dead or alive. £1.5 million dead or alive. These people is given for the capture or death of Gaddafi. Now, the problem with it, and the problem where I see going happen with these NATO forces, included France, especially France and England and America, is that them are letting some people to take over power because them hate Gaddafi so much that anybody else will do at this moment in time. And we have seen precedent set where America is always backing the wrong people eventually. I mean, history show that everywhere America go, forget out one and put in the next one. Right down the line, the next one turn against them. So we say from the beginning, a whole heap of foreign soldiers were used to fight in Afghanistan, join up with the rebels them, we now take over the country. Now Tripoli is the last place I'm supposed to take over, and now them inside so. And the Western world is so feeling so good that them get out Gaddafi. You know what I'm saying? When push come to shove, who going to take the blame? Well, we're going to see what going to happen now that them get out Gaddafi. They are scared that them don't want to keep him alive. So it's either he must leave the country or get killed. Because them know say if him about him going to do certain things. Him still have him power. Even though them freeze him money. But it's 40 years him dead, so him know what to do and what not to do. So we're going to see what happen. We don't see the news since we leave my yard to find out what is the latest news. If them actually find him or if them kill him or whatsoever. But that is something left to be seen. We say America is going on like them don't have nothing to do with nothing. Them feel very easy though. We see America go like them don't have nothing to do with nothing in this Libyan thing, you know. But it posts lie that them them don't take a step against Syria, and the Syrian government, there's more people dying, more protesters dying in Syria than in Libya. And when we see is that at the first hint of an uprising in Libya, America jump in there and say, yes, they have to get him out. Well, we understand that still, because Gaddafi is a thorn in them side from years, you know, and he's a man where him not care. Him want to totally eradicate the connection with the Western world. You know, him did promise to pump billions of dollars in African countries in order to make them not depend on Western countries like America and England. You know, he wanted to break down the barriers that was maintained by former colonial masters, where them divide up countries in Africa. And he called for the dismantling of barriers in Africa. And he was putting the money where mouth is by offering to pump billions, not millions, billions of dollars in African states so as not to make them dependent on Western capitalist societies. Well, you know, say, all the oil they know, I tell you, why everywhere them people they attack, it have to oil there. You know, it's like, oil is always the place where them always attack. Oil is always there, you know. We are saying Venezuela, watch yourself, you know. Venezuela, watch yourself. Chevaz, watch yourself, you know, because them people is oil bent. Anyway, I was given a book. Well, it's really, it come like a comic, really, but it's not a comic in the true sense, because apparently this little book was written for even dumb people like me who don't have no historical reference point can understand it. You know what I'm going to do tonight, you know? I'm not going to selfish with the book, you know. I'm going to read the book to the listeners. Yes. The whole light, well, openly, that I can read the whole light. But it's, as we say, the book set up like a comic. It's set up like a comic, but it's a very interesting book. For those of you who want to know the name of the book and who want to go scout out the book for yourself, we want to tell you the book name, Addicted to War. Addicted to War. Why the United States can't kick militarism. Why the United States cannot kick militarism. And this one that I have is an updated version because it includes the war in Iraq. And on the front it says over 300,000 in print worldwide. And it has been translated in many languages. And it has been endorsed by a lot of ex-soldiers. A lot of ex-soldiers endorse this book, Addicted to War. Now what we're going to do tonight, we're going to read the book, because we think it have a lot of historical facts in it, reference points, and just the idea that is some American involved in this writing of this book is very interesting. You know, and especially what is going on right now with the invasion of Libya. And there's so much things in this thing here that it's like a schoolroom. It's a schoolroom to United States militarism. It's a schoolroom. This little book here it show you in details, in a very simple way, what America historically is in terms of warmongering. So, for those of you who know, say, you have foreign, what you call foreign things I study, and who I study American history in relationship to war and the military. This program is the right program to listen to get an in-depth view and idea about how America spend most of the money in just facilitating weapons, and more weapons. It's a very serious thing, and I really want to call the name of the book again, it name Addicted to War, Why the U.S. Can't Kick Militarism. Why, and it's as I said before, it's a very simple book. I say simply, I think what's up there. Anyway, it's a very simple book. Yeah, I mean, even the dumb and ignorant can understand it. It come out of Oakland, California. Well, the press will press it come out of Oakland, California. We are going to share this book here with the people them tonight. Because we feel, say, this is what radio is all about. This is really what radio is all about. Sharing information. And sometimes, if people don't travel, and sometimes you don't have internet, you don't have access to certain information. You understand? You don't really have access to certain information. So this is all about accessing information and presenting the information, and whatever you want to do with the information, that is your business. So this is the Cutting Edge on IRFM. So now, we want to read the book now. As we tell you, we have this book named Addicted to War, Why the U.S. Can't Kick Militarism. And it is going to give you some history here. So as we say, we're going into the classroom now. So why listen keenly? Because this information is information where people actually pay for. Anything where you hear we say after now is coming from the book. Okay, ready? Here goes. Chapter 1, Manifest Destiny. The American revolutionaries who rose up against King George in 1776 spoke eloquently about the right of every nation to determine its own destiny. Thomas Jefferson, from the Declaration of Independence, 1776, said, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Unfortunately, after they won the right to determine their own destiny, they thought they should determine everyone else's too. The leaders of the newly independent colonies believed that they were preordained to rule all of North America. This was so obvious to them that they called it manifest destiny. Quote, "We must march from ocean to ocean. It is the destiny of the white race." This is a representative named Veichles from Maryland. The manifest destiny soon led to genocidal wars against the Native American people. The U.S. Army ruthlessly seized their land, driving them west and slaughtering those who resisted. During the century that followed the American Revolution, the Native American people were defeated one by one. Their lands were taken and they were confined to reservations. The number of dead has never been counted, but the tragedy did not end with the dead. The native people's way of life was devastated. And this is a quote from a Native American named Black Elk. "I can still see the butchered women and children lying heaped and scattered all along the crooked conch as plain as when I saw them with eyes still young. And I can see that something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. The nation's hope is broken and scattered." By 1848, the United States had seized nearly half of Mexico's territory. Now, a whole heap of you might not know this, but Mexico extended these states, and we're going to call out the states that was once Mexico, before the Europeans, the white people, them thief it. 1848. These are the countries that was stolen, that was called Mexico one time. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Colorado, parts of Wyoming. All of these territory was seized from Mexico in 1848. And that was half of Mexico's territory. In Congress, the war against Mexico was justified with speeches about the glory of expanding Anglo-Saxon democracy. But in truth, it was the southern slave owners' thirst for land and the lure of western gold that inspired these speeches. With their domain now stretching from coast to coast, the Manifest Destiny crowd began to dream of an overseas empire. Economic factors drove these ambitions. Colonel Charles Denby, a railroad magnate and an ardent expansionist, argued, quote, "Our condition at home is forcing us to commercial expansion. Day by day, production is exceeding home consumption. We are after markets. The greatest markets is the world," unquote. Call for empire was echoing through the halls of Washington. I firmly believe, and this is an ex-senator, Orville Platt, I firmly believe that when any territory outside the present territorial limits of the United States becomes necessary for our defense or essential for our commercial development, we ought to lose no time in acquiring it. To become a world power, the United States built a world-class navy. A gung-ho Theodore Roosevelt was put in charge of it. And this is quoting Theodore Roosevelt, 1897. I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. He didn't have long to wait. The next year, taking a fancy to several Spanish colonies, including Cuba and the Philippines, the U.S. declared war on Spain. Rebel armies were already fighting for independence in both countries, and Spain was on the verge of defeat. Washington declared that it was on the rebel side, and Spain quickly capitulated. But the U.S. soon made it clear that it had no intention of leaving. This is a quote from Senator Albert Beveridge. The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's eliminatable markets. The Pacific is our ocean. And for the senator, the Pacific was only the beginning. There's an next quote from him. The power that rules the Pacific is the power that rules the world. That power is and will forever be the American Republic. Elaborate racist theories were invented to justify colonialism, and these theories were adopted enthusiastically in Washington. Quote from Albert Beveridge. We are the ruling race of the world. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race. Trustee under God of the civilization of the world, He has marked us as its chosen people. He has made us adept in government, that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. Unquote. But the Filipinos didn't share the views of Senator Beveridge and his buddies. They fought the new invaders as they had fought the Spanish. The U.S. subjugated the Philippines with brute force. U.S. soldiers were ordered to burn all and kill all, and they did. By the time the Filipinos were defeated, 600,000 died. U.S. and they show a picture here with the U.S. soldiers standing on the bones of the Filipinos. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam were made into U.S. colonies in 1898. Cuba was formally given its independence, but along with it, the Cubans were given the Platt Amendment, which stipulated that the U.S. Navy would operate a base in Cuba forever, that the U.S. Marines would intervene at will, and that Washington would determine Cuba's foreign and financial policies. No, don't say I never give you anything. This is Uncle Sam talking here. Okay. During the same period, the U.S. overthrew a wise Queen Laleokolani and transformed these unspoiled Pacific islands into a U.S. Navy base surrounded by Dole and Del Monte plantations in 1903. After Theodore Roosevelt became president, he sent gunboats to rescue Panama's separation from Colombia. The Colombian government had refused Roosevelt terms for building a canal. And then they say, if they won't sell it, I'll take it. Then Uncle Sam began sending his Marines everywhere. The Marines went to China, Russia, North Africa, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. Between 1898 and 1934, the Marines invaded Cuba 4 times, Nicaragua 5 times, Honduras 7 times, the Dominican Republic 4 times, Haiti 2 times, Guatemala 1 time, Panama 2 times, Mexico 3 times, and Colombia 4 times. In many countries, the Marines stayed on as an occupying army, sometimes for decades. When the Marines finally went home, they typically left the countries they had occupied in the hands of a friendly dictator, armed to the teeth to suppress his own people. Behind the Marines came legions of U.S. business executives, ready not only to sell their goods, but also to set up plantations, drill oil wells, and stake out mining claims. The Marines returned when called upon to enforce slave-like working conditions and put down strikes, protest, and rebellion. Companies like Standard Oil, United Fruit, Domino Sugar, Anaconda Copper, and President William Howard Taft in 1910 said, "I accept responsibility for active intervention to secure for our capitalist opportunity for profitable investments." A reporter described what took place after U.S. troops landed in Haiti in 1915 to put down a peasant rebellion. American Marines opened fire with machine guns from airplanes on defenseless Haitian villages, killing men, women, and children in the open marketplaces for sport. 50,000 Haitians were killed. General Smedley Butler was one of the most celebrated leaders of these marine expeditions. After he retired, he reconsidered his career, describing it as follows. And this is the Marine named Smedley Butler. "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service. And during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Thus I helped made Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of 6 Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1902-1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. World War I was a horrific battle among the European colonial powers. Sorry, let me read it again. World War I was a horrific battle among the European colonial powers over how to divide up the world. When President Woodrow Wilson decided to enter the fray, he told the American people that he was sending troops to Europe to, quote, make the world safe for democracy. But what Wilson was really after was what he considered to be the United States' fair share of the spoils. Wilson's ambassador to England said rather forthrightly that the U.S. would declare war on Germany because it was, quote, the only way of maintaining our present preeminent trade status. For this, 130,274 U.S. soldiers were sent to their death. Our boys were sent off to die with beautiful ideals painted in front of them. No one told them that dollars and cents were the real reason they were marching off to kill and die. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It wasn't. During World War II, millions of young Americans signed up to fight Germany fascism and Japanese imperialism. But the goals of the strategic planner in Washington were far less admirable. They had imperial ambitions of their own. In October 1940, as Germany and Japanese troops were marching in Europe and Asia, a group of prominent government officials, business executives and bankers was convened by the U.S. State Department and the Council of Foreign Relations to discuss U.S. strategy. They were concerned with maintaining an Anglo-American sphere of influence that included the British Empire, the Far East and the Western Hemisphere. They concluded that the country had to prepare for war and came up with, quote, an integrated policy to achieve military and economical supremacy for the United States. Of course, they didn't say this publicly. And this is what they didn't say publicly. And this is coming from the private memorandum between the Council on Foreign Relationship and the State Department, 1941. Quote, if war aims are stated, which seems to be concerned solely with Anglo-American imperialism, they will offer little to people in the rest of the world. The interests of the other people should be stressed. This would have a better propaganda effect. A horrendous war was concluded with horrendous event. 200,000 people were killed instantaneously when the U.S. dropped nuclear bombs, first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. Tens of thousands more died later from radiation poisoning. And it is interesting to know that America is the only country that has ever used a H-bomb. And this is a quote from President Harry Truman, 1945. We pray that God might guide us to use the bomb in his ways and for his purpose. This is President Truman, I pray to God. He said, we pray that God might guide us to use the bomb in his ways and for his purposes. The defeat of Japan had really been assured before the bombs were dropped. Their main purpose was to demonstrate to the world the deadly power of America's new weapon of mass destruction. World War II left the U.S. in a position of political, economic, and military superiority. Quote, we must set the pace and assume the responsibility of the majority stockholder in this corporation known as the world. The U.S. eagerly assumed responsibility for determining the economic policies and selecting the management of what it considered to be the subsidiary companies that made up the corporation known as the world. But this didn't go over too well in many nations. What it considered to be the subsidiary companies that made up the corporation known as the world. But this didn't go over too well in many nations that considered themselves to be sovereign countries. This is the Cutting Edge on RFM. The time is 12 o'clock. We continue the reading from the book named Addicted to War, Why the U.S. Can't Kick Militarism. Chapter 2, The Cold War and the Exploits of the Self-Proclaimed World Policeman. The United States, however, had to contend with the Soviet Union, which had also emerged from the Second World War as a world power. For the next 45 years, the world was caught up in a global turf battle between the two superpowers. The U.S. was always much stronger than the Soviet adversary. But both countries maintained huge military forces to defend and expand their own sphere of influence. The contention between the two powers was called the Cold War because they never directly engaged each other in battle. But the Cold War was marked by plenty of violence in other countries. Typically, the two superpowers lined up on opposite sides of every conflict. For its part, the U.S. moved to expand its own sphere of influence beyond the American and the Pacific to include much of the old British, French, and Japanese colonies or colonial empires in Asia and Africa. In doing so, it had to deal with local aspirations that did not always accord with American plans to put down insubordination, disorder, and disloyalty in its sphere. The new majority stockholder also appointed itself the world policeman. During the Cold War, Washington intervened militarily in foreign countries more than 200 times. During the Cold War, Washington intervened militarily in foreign countries more than 200 times. 1. Korea, 1950 to 1953. After World War II, the ambitious plans of the U.S. State Department for Asia and the Pacific were upset completely by revolutions and anti-colonial wars from China to Malaysia. A major confrontation developed in Korea. Washington decided to intervene directly to show that Western military technology could defeat any Asian army. U.S. warships, bombers, and artillery reduced much of Korea to rubble. Over 4,500,000 Koreans died. 3 out of 4 were civilians. 54,000 U.S. soldiers returned home in coffins. But the U.S. military, for all of its technology superiority, did not prevail. After 3 years of intense warfare, a ceasefire was negotiated. Korea is still divided, and some 40,000 U.S. troops remain in southern Korea to this day, waiting for another war. This is interesting. Between 1950 and 1953, which is 3 years, over 4,500,000 Koreans died. 3 out of 4 were civilians. 54,000 U.S. soldiers returned home in coffins. This is the Korean War. Dominican Republic, 1965. After U.S.-backed military coup, Dominicans rose up to demand the reinstatement of the overthrown presidents who they had elected in a popular vote. Washington, however, was determined to keep its men in power. No matter who the Dominicans voted for, 22,000 U.S. troops were sent to suppress the uprising. 3,000 people were gunned down in the streets of Santo Domingo. This is America for you, you know. It's not the Al-Qaeda we are talking about, no, you know. It's America. Okay. Vietnam, 1964 to 1973. For 10 years, the U.S. assaulted Vietnam with all the deadly force the Pentagon could muster, trying to preserve a corrupt South Vietnamese regime, which had been inherited from the French colonial empire. The U.S. may have used more firepower in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than had been used by all sides in all previous wars in human history. The U.S. may have used more firepower in Indochina, which include Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, than had been used by all sides in all previous wars in human history. And then one of the quotes, one of them say, sometimes you have to destroy a country to save it. U.S. warplanes dropped 7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. U.S. warplanes dropped 7 million tons of bombs on Vietnam. That's the equivalent of 1 350-pound bomb per person. 400,000 tons of napalm were rained down on the tiny country. Agent Orange and other toxic herbicides were used to destroy millions of acres of farmland and forests. Villages were burned to the ground and their residents massacred. Altogether, 2 million people died in the Indochina War, most of them civilians killed by U.S. bombs and bullets. Almost 60,000 U.S. soldiers were killed and 300,000 U.S. soldiers wounded. Despite the ferocity of the assault on Vietnam, the U.S. was ultimately defeated by a lightly armed but determined peasant army. Despite the ferocity of the assault on Vietnam, the U.S. was ultimately defeated by lightly armed but determined peasant army. Lebanon, 1982 to 1983. After the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the U.S. Marines intervened directly in the Lebanese civil war, taking the side of Israel and the right-wing Phalange militia, which had just massacred 20,000 Palestinian civilians. 241 Marines paid for their intervention with their lives when their barracks were blown up by a truck bomb. Grenada, that is just near where we are now, 1983. About 110,000 people live in the tiny Caribbean island of Grenada. About the same number that live in Peoria, Illinois. But according to Ronald Reagan, Grenada represented a threat to the U.S. security. So he ordered the Pentagon to seize the island and install a new government, more to his liking. And one of the Secretary of State, George Shultz, in 1983 said, a lovely piece of real estate. This is America invade the little island, you know, with only 110,000 people. And a lot of us remember that invasion, that Jamaica, some Jamaicans get involved with it. Libya, 1986. Washington loved King Address, the Libyan monarch, who happily turned over his country's oil reserve to Standard Oil for next to nothing. It aids Colonel Gaddafi, who threw the king out. In 1986, Reagan ordered the U.S. warplanes to bomb the Libyan capital, Tripoli, claiming that Gaddafi was responsible for a bomb attack at a German disco that killed 2 U.S. soldiers. It's unlikely that very many of the hundreds of Libyans killed or injured in the U.S. bombing raid knew anything about the German bombing. So far, we've recounted wars that have involved U.S. troops, but there are many other wars in which Washington is involved behind the scenes. After World War II, Britain was compelled to dispose of its colonial empire in the Middle East. The British gave a big chunk of the land known as Palestine to European Jews displaced by the Holocaust. The problem was that there were already people living there. The result has been 5 decades of violence and war. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their homes in what became Israel. The center of the conflict has been the West Bank and Gaza, where Palestinians have lived for decades under Israeli occupation. The U.S. provides crucial political support and billions of dollars a year in aid to Israel, including the most advanced weaponry. More than 3 decades of occupation of the West Bank and Gaza have produced bitter anger, not only at Israel, but also at the United States, as Palestinian teenagers continue to die in confrontations with the Israeli army. This anger only grows. The U.S. government stands behind its friends, including dictatorial regimes suppressing their own people. In the 1970s and 80s, popular insurgencies challenged corrupt dictatorship in Central America. The Pentagon and the U.S. armed and trained security forces and death squads that kill hundreds of thousands of people, mostly unarmed peasants in Nicaragua and El Salvador and Guatemala. Don't blame them. They were terrorists disguised as peasants. This is a quote from one of the soldiers, the headman there. Many of the military officers responsible for the worst atrocities in Central America were trained at the Pentagon School of the Americas in Georgia. The school trains officers from all over Latin America. This training, it's training manuals, and this is serious because we hear like America is going on like them is like Jesus for war. In other words, them don't do certain things. But listen to this. There's a school called the School of the Americas in Georgia. The school trains officers from all over Latin America. Its training manual recommends torture and summary execution. Its graduates have returned to establish military regimes and terrorize their own people. Today, bloody US-backed counterinsurgency war continues in Colombia, Mexico, Peru, the Philippines, and other countries in Colombia. A corrupt US-backed army fights alongside paramilitary forces that have slaughtered whole of villages and hundreds of opposition union leaders and politicians. The US has been getting more deeply involved under the cover of the war on drugs, providing billions of dollars for arms used to continue the killing. The CIA and the Pentagon have also organized proxy armies to overthrow governments that are not well liked in Washington. In 1961, for instance, U.S. warships ferried a small army of mercenaries to Cuba, hoping to reverse the Cuban Revolution. They landed on the Bay of Pigs. It was the 5th U.S. invasion of Cuba, but this time the U.S. was defeated. In the 1970s and 80s, the CIA was particularly busy financing, training, and arming guerrilla armies around the world. For years, the U.S. backed Portugal's effort to hang on to the colonies in southern Africa, helping it stave out independent wars in Angola and Mozambique. In 1975, after a democratic revolution in Portugal, the Portuguese called it quits, but Washington didn't. Instead, it teamed up with the apartheid regime in South Africa to supply a mercenary army to fight the new government in independent Angola and in Mozambique. Top U.S. and South African politicians and ex-military officers sponsored a particularly brutal bunch of mercenaries who massacred tens of thousands of peasants. This was during the South African apartheid time. And then, of course, there are the Contras. After the Nicaraguan people overthrew the U.S.-backed the dictatorship of the Somoza family in 1979, the CIA gathered together the remnants of Somoza's hated National Guard and sent them back to Nicaragua with all the weapons they could carry to loot, burn, and kill. And this was under Ronald Reagan, and him quote, "The Contras are the moral equivalent of our founding fathers." This is a quote from Ronald Reagan in 1985. Reagan said the Contras are the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a friendly regime. Soviet occupation met fierce popular resistance. The CIA stepped in to arm, finance, and train the Afghan Mujahideens, guerrillas, working closely with the Pakistan and Saudi governments, with generous support from Washington and its allies. The Mujahideen defeated the Soviets after a brutal decade-long war. Among the CIA's collaborators in this war was a Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Together with the CIA, bin Laden supplied the Afghan Mujahideens with money and guns to fight the Soviets. The Afghan war helped militarize and internationalize Islamic movements to rid the Muslim world of foreign domination. Ultimately, this movement didn't like the United States any more than the Soviets at the time. However, the U.S. bankers of bin Laden and the Mujahideens were not overly concerned about their wider goals. Okay. In the 1980s, Reagan stepped up the arms race, increasing military spending to unprecedented levels. The Soviets were a much smaller economic struggle to keep up. But they couldn't. Massive military spending put tremendous strain on Soviet society, contributing to its collapse. The U.S. won the arms race and the Cold War. As the Cold War came to an end, some people began talking about an era of world peace and a peace dividend. But behind closed doors at the White House and the Pentagon, the talk was quite different. They were busy planning a new era of wars. Chapter 3, the New World Order. Bush, the father, we are the only superpower, the New World Order. In 1989, as the Eastern Bloc began to crumble, top U.S. government strategists gathered to discuss the world situation. The Soviet Union, they happily agreed, was no longer able or inclined to counter U.S. military intervention abroad. It was time they decided to demonstrate U.S. military power to the world. The White House wanted some decisive victories. So they started to map out the places that they think they could really occupy. And this is a quote from the National Security Council Policy Review document in 1989. Quote, in cases where the U.S. confronts much weaker enemies, our challenge will be not simply to defeat them, but to defeat them decisively and rapidly. Panama, 1989. Panama was the first country selected to be much weaker enemy. Ever since U.S. warships brought Panama into existence, U.S. troops have intervened in the small country whenever Washington deemed it necessary. George H.W. Bush continued this tradition in 1989, sending in 25,000 troops, supposing to arrest a drug dealer. The drug charges were only a pretext. The real motive was assuring U.S. control over the Panama Canal and the extensive U.S. military bases in their country. A new Panamanian president was sworn in at a U.S. air base moments before the invasion, hardly Mr. Clean. The man the U.S. State Department picked for the job, Guillermo Endara, ran a bank that is notorious for money laundering. Of course, not only Panamanian banks are involved in this business. Most big U.S. banks have set up branches in Panama City. And drug trafficking and money laundering have increased sharply in Panama since Operation Just Cause. According to Panamanian human rights groups, several thousand people are killed in the U.S. invasion. 26 were U.S. soldiers, 50 were Panamanian soldiers, the rest were civilians, cut down by the overwhelming U.S. firepower pouring into crowded neighborhoods in poor sections of Panama City and Colon. Many of the dead were put in garbage bags and secretly buried in mass graves. This is not Saddam Hussein we are talking about. Iraq, 1991. Only 13 months after the invasion of Panama, the U.S. went to war again, this time on a much larger scale. The 1991 U.S.-Iraq war continued an epic battle for control over the immensely rich oil fields of the Persian Gulf that began over 75 years later. During World War I, the British conquered the region that is now Iraq and Kuwait, seizing it from the declining Ottoman Empire. In 1920, hundreds of British soldiers and many more Iraqis died when the British Army suppressed a revolt against British rule. Britain ended up installing an unpicked king of Iraq. The new monarch promptly signed a deal with British and American oil companies, giving them the right to exploit all of Iraq's oil for 75 years in exchange for pittance in royalties. As the British Empire declined, the U.S. became the senior partner in an enduring Anglo-American alliance. The Middle East became a key part of their global sphere of influence. The Middle East possesses almost 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves. Control over the flow of oil by U.S. and British companies gave Washington strategic power over Europe, Japan, and the developing world. The U.S. State Department declared that Middle Eastern oil was, quote, a stupendous source of strategic power, one of the greatest prizes in world history, unquote. Washington came to think of the oil fields in the Middle East as its own private reserves. In 1958, U.S. and British oil companies were startled when the king of Iraq was overthrown. The new leader, a nationalist military officer named Abdel Karim Kazim, demanded changes in the sweetheart deals the monarchy had made with the oil companies. He also helped form OPEC, the cartel of oil producing countries. In 1963, the CIA collaborated with the Ba'ath Party to murder Kazim and overthrow his government. The Ba'ath Party was also nationalist, but at least it was anti-communist. It systematically killed its leftist opponents, and the CIA was happy to help. These Ba'ath guys, all right, yes, okay. Among the CIA collaborators in the 1963 coup was a young military officer named Saddam Hussein, who later emerged as the top leader in Iraq. But Hussein soon disappointed his accomplice in the U.S. by nationalizing the Iraq oil industry. Other Arab leaders followed suit, greatly alarming U.S. officials. And Henry Kissinger says, oil is much too important a commodity to be left in the hands of the Arabs. Then in 1980, Hussein did something that made him more popular in Washington. He decided to invade Iran. U.S. officials were delighted. After the 1979 Iranian Revolution, American strategists considered Iran the main threat to U.S. interests in the Middle East. The U.S. and its allies therefore were happy to provide Hussein with advanced weaponry. U.S. companies even sold Iraq materials to make chemical and biological weapons, including highly lethal strains of anthrax. Iraqi used chemical weapons against both Iranian troops and insurgent Kurdish villagers inside Iraq. The Reagan administration knew this, but the U.S. continued to supply Saddam Hussein not only with the necessary chemicals, but also with satellite photos of the positions of Iranian troops. Over 100,000 Iranian soldiers were killed or injured by poison gas. In 1987, the Reagan administration intervened directly in the Iran-Iraq war on Iraq side, sending a naval armada to the Persian Gulf to protect the oil tankers of a country that was their Iraq's ally, Kuwait. Using state-of-the-art weaponry, the U.S. Navy blew up an Iranian oil platform, destroyed several small speedboats, and recklessly shot down an Iranian passenger airliner, killing all 290 passengers. And then they said, we had to defend our ship. This is serious reading, you know. This is serious reading here. I am reading after what I read here. And, okay, they destroyed several small speed ships and recklessly shot down. Now, how much time we hear? We hear say, when name Gaddafi did not protect one man when it blew up a Panamanian airline. America, 1987, shot down an Iranian passenger. This is not a Al-Qaeda magazine may I read. This is an American book published in California by Americans, endorsed by Americans, a lot of Americans, including all veterans of the war. Okay, so they shoot down this airline, killing all 290 passengers. Okay, wow. Despite U.S. support, Saddam Hussein failed to seize any of Iran's oil fields. So he then turned his attention to the oil fields of his southern neighbors, which was Kuwait. So he decided to invade Kuwait. Hussein apparently expected that the U.S. would also tactically go along with his invasion of Kuwait. For the U.S., however, Kuwait was very different from Iran. The Kuwait Emir was a loyal friend of the U.S. and British oil companies and a close political ally of the United States. George H.W. Bush, which is the father of the other Bush, worried that the huge Iraqi army had become a threat to U.S. domination of the Middle East. And this is a quote from George Bush in 1990. Our jobs, our way of life, our own freedom, and the freedom of friendly countries around the world would all suffer if control of the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of Saddam Hussein. Bush decided Hussein had to be punished for trespassing on an oil-rich U.S. protectorate. And now, the Pentagon launched the most intensive bombing campaign in history, using conventional bombs, cluster bombs, designed to rip bodies apart, napalm and phosphorus, which cling to unburned skins, and fuel air explosive, which have the impact of small nuclear bombs. Later, the U.S. used ammunition tipped with depleted uranium, which is now suspected as a cause of cancer among both Iraqis and U.S. soldiers and their children. Iraq was bombed back to a pre-industrial age, and tens of thousands were killed. The war had a message for the world. What we say go. This is a quote from George W. Bush, 1991. Baghdad and Basra were bombed relentlessly, killing thousands of civilians. Iraq had already begun to withdraw from Kuwait when Bush launched the ground war. The main aim of the ground offensive war was, in fact, not to drive the Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, but to keep them from leaving. The gate was closed, and tens of thousands of soldiers who were trying to go home were systematically slaughtered. Elsewhere, U.S. tanks and bulldozers intentionally buried thousands of soldiers alive in their trenches in a tactic designed mainly to destroy Iraqi's defense. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers was buried alive by U.S. tanks and bulldozers. George H. Bush, January 1991. In the life of a nation, there comes a moment when we are called upon to define who we are and what we believe. Tens of thousands of Iraqis died during the war, and the tragedy continued after the war ended. And this is not the war with the other day. This is the one where them say, where Saddam say the mother of all wars, where them say this is Desert Storm. This is not the one we're gone the other day, where Saddam dead. Tens of thousands of Iraqis died during the war, and the tragedy continued after the war ended. Even more people died from waterborne diseases that spread because the U.S. systematically destroyed Iraq's electrical sewage treatment and water treatment system. For over a decade, the U.S. insisted on maintaining the most severe economic sanctions regime in history, continuing to strangle this devastated Iraqi economy with dire consequences for the Iraqi people. In 1999, UNICEF estimated that infant and child mortality had more than doubled since the war. It attributed this sharp increase in mortality mainly to malnutrition and deteriorating health conditions caused by the war and ongoing sanctions. It estimated that 500,000 more children died as a result. That's 5,200 children a month. Bush's successor, Bill Clinton, not only kept up the sanctions, but also continued to bomb Iraq regularly for 8 years. And the U.S. war on Iraq was far from over. Kosovo, 1999. In the late 1990s, after enduring years of abuse at the hands of a Serbian-dominated Yugoslav government, Albanian rebels in Kosovo started a war for successions. The U.S. usually does not support minority groups demanding separation, but it all depends on whether the U.S. supports the government of the country facing disarmament. For instance, the U.S. supports Kurdish separatists in Iraq and Iran, but across the border in Turkey, a close ally, Washington, has provided tons of arms to crush the Kurds with U.S. help. Tens of thousands have been killed. And him say, our policy is to clear, we support people fighting for their freedom and oppose terrorist separatists. Okay. Because the Yugoslav strongman Slobodan Milosevic, was being less than cooperative with U.S. efforts, he extended his influence in Eastern Europe. Breaking up Yugoslavia was a cause the U.S. could warm up to. The Clinton administration embraced the Kosovo Liberation Army despite their drug dealing, ethnic extremism, and brutality. Following established practice, the administration issued an ultimatum the Yugoslavs could not possibly accept. And here's the deal. First, NATO takes over Kosovo. Second, NATO has free access to all of Yugoslavia. Third, you help pay for the NATO-run government. Sign here, or we bomb you. Okay. The NATO bombing turned an ugly but small-scale Yugoslav counterinsurgency operation into a massive ethnic cleansing drive. After the bombing began, Serbian soldiers and militia members began driving hundreds of thousands of Albanians out of the country and killed thousands of others. When the Albanians returned under NATO protection, Serbian and Gypsy residents were driven out and killed. Ultimately, the war served U.S. political objectives, while causing tremendous death and suffering on all sides and greatly aggravating ethnic antagonism. This is the Cutting Edge, and IRFM. We're there with you. Chapter 4. The War on Terrorism. After the horrific September 11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, one question was so sensitive it was seldom seriously addressed by the U.S. media. The question is, Mom, why did they do it? To find out, it makes sense to ask the prime suspect himself. As U.S. warplanes began bombing Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden released a videotape message. He praised the September 11th attacks and called for more attacks on the United States. Then he spelled out his motivations quite clearly, quoting Osama bin Laden, October 7, 2001. What America is tasting now is something insignificant compared to what we have tasted for scores of years. Our nation, the Islamic world, has been tasting the humiliation and degradation for more than 80 years. Its sons are killed, its blood is shed, its sanctuaries are attacked, and no one hears and no one heeds. Millions of innocent children are being killed as I speak. They are being killed in Iraq without committing any sins to America. I say only a few words to it and its people. I swear to God, who has elevated the skies without pillars, neither America nor the people who live in it will dream of security before we live. If here in Palestine and not before, all infidel armies leave the land of Muhammad. Peace be upon him. Quote from bin Laden. Few people anywhere in the world, including the Middle East, support bin Laden's terrorist methods. But most people in the Middle East share his anger at the United States. They are angry at the U.S. for supporting corrupt and dictatorial regimes in the region, for supporting Israel at the expense of the Palestinians, and for imposing U.S. dictates on the Middle East through military might and brutal economic sanctions. The Bush administration immediately instructed U.S. television networks to exercise caution in hearing bin Laden's tape messages. The official reason was the tapes may contain secret coding messages for terrorist operations. But were covert messages the administration's main concern? Perhaps it was more worried about the impact of bin Laden's overt message, that the September 11 attackers were carried out in retaliation for U.S. foreign policy and particular U.S. and military intervention in the Middle East. If Americans realize that U.S. military intervention abroad brought retaliation, causing death and destruction at home, we might think twice about whether the U.S. should be so eager to go to war overseas. The Pentagon has demonstrated time and time again that its advanced weaponry can devastate countries targeted for attack, leveling basic infrastructures and killing thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people. Over the last several decades, the true cost of the wars the U.S. has waged overseas have been largely hidden. We have had to pay the military bills, but few Americans have died. The death and destruction were all overseas. That changed on September 11. The violence reached the United States. The September 11 attacks, however, were not simple acts of retribution. They were also a provocation. Bin Laden expected the U.S. to respond with massive violence, knowing this would bring him new recruits. Ultimately, he hoped to win the majority of the Muslim world to support his holy war on the U.S. The Bush administration responded according to bin Laden's script. George W. Bush declared a war on terrorism using good versus evil rhetoric that mirrored bin Laden's. Bush and his advisors were ready, even eager for the war bin Laden wanted. They saw the September 11 attackers as a grand opportunity to boost military spending and demonstrate U.S. military power to the world. And this is a quote from George Bush, September the 12th, 2001. This will be a monumental struggle of good versus evil. This crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while. The self-righteous good versus evil rhetoric of the war on terrorism sharpens ironies that have long shadowed U.S. pronouncements against state-sponsored terrorism. President Bush, for instance, promised to scour the globe in search of states that harbor terrorists. He could have started in the state of Florida. For over 40 years, Miami has served as the base of operations for well-financed groups of Cuban exiles that have carried out violent terrorist attacks on Cuba. Most recently, they bombed a number of Havana tourist spots in 1997, killing an Italian tourist, and they tried to assassinate Fidel Castro in Panama in 2000. It would not be difficult for the U.S. government to find evidence involving these terrorist organizations because the CIA and the Pentagon trained many of their members. Take, for instance, Luis Pasado Carriles and Orlando Bosch, suspected masterminds of the bombing of the Cuban passenger airline that claimed the lives of 73 people. Before Pasada could be tried for the airline bombing, he escaped from a prison in Venezuela and found a job supplying arms to the CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contras. Posada's accomplice, Orlando Bosch, has long been protected from extradition by the U.S. government. Although Bosch was convicted of carrying out a bazooka attack on a ship in Miami Harbor, President H.W. Bush, at the urging of his son, Jeb, prevented his expulsion from the country. Bush signed an executive pardon providing Bush with safe haven in Florida. And then he promised to rejoin the struggle. If George Bush had been serious about going after all states that harbor terrorists, he would have issued an ultimatum to his brother, the governor of Florida. Posada, Bush, and his friends are only a few of the violent characters whose activities have been sponsored by the CIA. Many of the CIA's covert operations, bombings, assassinations, sabotage, and paramilitary massacres are terrorism by any definition. Many of the shadowy figures involved in these activities are still working with the CIA around the world. But others, including Osama bin Laden, have turned on their former American partners. Afghanistan, 2001. Bush's war on terrorism began with U.S. warplanes bombing Afghanistan, the unfortunate country where bin Laden chose to locate his headquarters. At that time, Afghanistan was ruled by fundamentalist Muslim clerics of the Taliban movement, whom both bin Laden and the CIA had supported during the anti-Soviet war. Now Washington decided to destroy its former allies. The people of Afghanistan suffer the consequences. U.S. bombs killed hundreds and perhaps thousands of civilians, and the war cut off relief supplies to millions already facing starvation. The total number of deaths will never be known, but it's certain that many more civilians died in the U.S. assault on Afghanistan than in the attack on the World Trade Center. The U.S. made common cause with a new set of Afghan allies, brutal regional warlords under U.S. auspices. Islamic fundamentalism has been replaced by brazen corruption as warlords fight for power and prey on the people under their jurisdiction. The opium trade, which the zealous Taliban clerics had briefly suppressed, once again flourishes and under the warlords. And Afghanistan regains its place as the world's top opium producer. Iraq, 2003. From the day they took office, Bush and his key lieutenants set their sights on Iraq. After 9/11, they packaged an invasion as part of the war on terrorism. To win UN backing, they claimed Saddam Hussein was developing nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The threat was so imminent, they said that an imminent invasion was imperative. And Bush said in 2002, we can't wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in form of a mushroom cloud. We now know that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction and that the Bush administration manipulated evidence to justify its war plans. Even then, it was clear that the specter of such weapons was just a pretext. The U.S. made no secret of its underlying war aims to install a pro-U.S. regime in Iraq and to increase U.S. military and political power in the Middle East. Bush therefore had little use for UN weapons inspection in Iraq. The UN refused to endorse the invasion, but the US and Britain went ahead anyway. The Iraq army was decimated and thousands of civilians who were unlucky enough to get into the way were also killed. As soon as US troops captured Baghdad, elated American officials began issuing threats to Iraq's neighbors, Syria and Iran. The message was, go along with the American program or else. The Bush administration had big plans based on Iraq's tremendous oil wealth and U.S. military might. American officials hoped to create a client regime in Iraq and use it as a base of U.S. power in the heart of the Arab Middle East. They brought in a group of Emiri politicians intended to install them as leaders of the new government. Their favorite was Ahmed Chalabi, a wealthy businessman who was convicted of bank fraud in Jordan. Chalabi won the hearts of White House officials in part by declaring that he favored pulling Iraqi out of OPEC and then privatizing Iraq oil and selling it off to foreign companies. But Bush and his friends overlooked one detail, that the people of Iraq might not go along with their plans. Bush declared that he had liberated the people of Iraq and that he would bring them democracy. The Iraqis quite naturally were suspicious. If the past is any indication that prospects for democracy in Iraq under U.S. tutelage are not good, the U.S. has overthrown many governments around the world, but the result was rarely been any kind of democracy. Instead, the result has always been brutal dictatorship. It soon became clear that American liberation of Iraq came with strings attached. But Bush appointed Paul Bremer, a counter-terrorism expert trained by Henry Kissinger, to head up the U.S. occupation of Iraq. U.S. oil companies, executives, and bankers were assigned to look after the Iraqi oil and industry and central bank. U.S. military officers were placed in charge of Iraqi cities. Bush promised to give sovereignty back to Iraqis, but he also made it clear that only a pro-American government would be acceptable. Because the U.S. is extremely unpopular among Arabs throughout the Middle East, if Iraqis actually were allowed to vote freely, they could hardly be expected to elect pro-U.S. candidates. That's why the U.S. adamantly resisted holding popular elections in occupied Iraq, instead proposing that members of a new governing assembly be selected by unpicked caucuses. And this is a quote from Paul Bremer. In a post-war situation like this, if you start holding elections, the people who are rejectionists tend to win. By rejectionists, Bremer meant those who oppose U.S. occupation. The U.S. occupation authority in Iraq was hardly a model of democratic government. Newspaper and radio and television stations that criticized the authority were shut down. Tens of thousands of Iraqis disappeared into prisons run by the U.S. military. Prisoners were held without charge and were subjected to humiliation, sexual abuse, and torture. U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft, after he sent a team to rebuild Iraq's system of courts and prisoners in 2003, said, "Now all Iraqis can taste liberty in their native land." Facing a hostile population, the U.S. military policed Iraqi cities and villages with heavy hand. Scores of Iraqis were killed as they protested against the occupation. Journalists were gunned down as they covered U.S. military operation. Others who were simply in their wrong place at the wrong time were shot at military checkpoints or when soldiers raided their neighbors. The U.S. occupation of Iraq followed the familiar path of previous colonial adventures. Iraqis organized armed resistance, and the U.S. military took increasingly harsh punitive measures against the population, inspiring fear and indignation. As U.S. soldiers and Iraqis died in daily battles, Bush's response was swaggering cowboy rhetoric. Quote, "There are some who feel like they can attack us. There, my answer is, bring them on." As resistance grew, American commanders became increasingly frustrated and aggressive. After 4 U.S. military contractors were brutally killed in Fallujah, the U.S. took revenge. Hundreds of residents were killed as densely packed neighborhoods were shelled by tanks and bombed and strafed by warplanes and helicopters. The siege of Fallujah only incited wider opposition throughout Iraq to U.S. occupation. By spring 2004, it was clear that Bush's grandiose plan had collapsed. The vast majority of Iraqis wanted the U.S. out, and they wanted nothing to do with any political association with Washington. Resistance drove up the cost of occupation, keeping over 135,000 troops in Iraq. It costs over $1 billion a week. Every day, U.S. Hey, this is not in the book. I wonder if a man knows, 9/11 changed everything in the world. And not only that, I wonder if a man knows, the reason why America in the position right now, in terms of finance, is not because of Obama not being able to function effectively, but because of America's loss for wars and the money that them spend on wars. No, if you are spend $1 billion a week to keep 135,000 people in an occupied state, then that must cripple the economy at your house. Yes. Every day U.S. soldiers return home in coffins, are disabled for life. But politicians and generals in Washington continue to insist that they would never back down, no matter what the cost. The U.S. occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, together with continued U.S. support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine, have added fuel to simmering anti-American sentiments across the Middle East. By invading and occupying Muslim countries, the U.S. is only inviting more attacks on U.S. soldiers and other American targets. The Pentagon has promised to respond with more violence. The spiral of bloodshed is escalating dangerously. America's long-time addiction to war has reached a new level, creating greater dangers for people in this country and around the world. Unfortunately, there are some people who profit handsomely from this addiction. Chapter 5, The War Profiteers. In the front line of the pro-war crowd, you'll find an assortment of politicians, generals, and corporate executives. If you ask them why they are so eager to go to war, they'll give you noble and selfless reasons. They will tell you democracy. Some will say freedom, some will say justice, some will say peace. But what really motivates them to go to war are somewhat less lofty aims. Contracts, markets, natural resources, and power. For most people, the huge Pentagon budget means less money in their pockets. But some people, just the opposite, it's true. Over 100,000 companies fed at the Pentagon trial, but the big money goes to a handful of huge corporations. United Technology, Textron, General Dynamics, Northern Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, the list goes on, General Electric. As they watch missiles flying and the bombs dropping in the Middle East, top executives at the big weapons manufacturers are adding up their profits. Their brains working like cash registers gone haywire. For weapons makers, war means more orders, not only from the Pentagon but also from overseas. After the first Gulf War demonstrated that their weapons can truly kill on a massive scale, foreign sales of U.S. weapons manufacturers skyrocketed. Let's take a look at some of the men in Washington who are most gung-ho about war. First one, Dick Cheney. And then they talk about Dick Cheney with him, Halliburton. You know, Dick Cheney was part of Halliburton. They have Richard Pearl. Yes. And then the list goes on again. No, in fact, under the banner of funding, the war on terrorism has abandoned efforts to avoid budget deficits. Instead, every year it gives the Pentagon what amounts to a blank check. After the end of the Cold War, many in Washington were reconsidering the humongous size of the military budget, which had converted the U.S. from the world's biggest lender into the world's biggest debtor. In an effort to balance the federal budget, politicians were beginning to trim the Pentagon's toenails. After September 11th, all this changed. Bush and the Congress started to pump up the Pentagon's bloated budget without restraint. Even congressional opposition to the far-fetched missile defense program collapsed. Missile defense, like the war on terrorism, promised to protect Americans from danger while actually creating a much more dangerous world. If other countries think there are any chance the U.S. could block their missiles, they will feel vulnerable to U.S. attack. China has already promised to build more and better missiles which could overwhelm the U.S. missile shield. This is for a nuclear arms race in Asia. If China builds more nuclear missiles, then India will. If India does, then Pakistan will. If Pakistan, the list goes on. In 1972, the US and the USSR signed the ABM Treaty to try to avoid this kind of arms race in order to pursue missiles of defense. The US unilaterally scrapped the treaty, but they didn't bother missile defense proponents. In this spirit, Congress rejected the nuclear test ban treaty, which has been signed by 164 countries, and it continues to finance nuclear weapons research and production. In fact, the Pentagon is eager to develop a new arsenal of small battlefield nuclear weapons. The U.S. is keeping enough nuclear weapons to wipe out most of humanity. As potential nuclear targets in Russia have declined, the Pentagon has been retargeting its missiles at every reasonable adversary. In the post-Cold War world order, the U.S. does not seem to want to be bound by any arms treaties. It refuses to sign a new protocol to the 1972 Biological Weapons Treaty because it would require international inspections of its biological weapons research facilities, where it is creating deadly new strains, including highly lethal powered anthrax. U.S. officials say they are only creating germ weapons in order to study how to defend against them. But can other countries trust a government that bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and actually develop plans to use smallpox and other biological weapons against Vietnam and Cuba? As a matter of fact, they use it against the Native Americans too, in the blankets. Go and read your history. They put smallpox in the blankets and gave the Native Americans. And they had a experiment called, this is not in the book here, they had an experiment called the Tuskegee experiment, where they injected syphilis in 300 black people, black men, to see what would happen. 300 black men. As a matter of fact, in the 90s, when Clinton was president, he actually apologized for the Tuskegee experiment. And it's a woman catch them. It's a woman find it out. 300 black men was injected with syphilis. Call it Tuskegee experiment. Go look it up. Back to the book. And U.S. weaponized germs not only represent a threat to people in other countries. What if some of the Pentagon's powdered anthrax got into the hands of some fanatic here in the United States? During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a serious military competitor for the United States. Today, the U.S. maintains a huge war machine despite the lack of any serious competition. The U.S. military budget is now larger than the next 25 biggest spenders put together. It makes up of a full 36% of total global military spending. You hear that? The U.S. military budget is now larger than the next 25 biggest spenders put together. It makes up a full 36% of total global military spending. In other words, the United States spend $399 million annual military expenditures. Russia spends $65 million, China spends $47 million, and Japan spend 43 billion. Sorry, it's billion, me talk about, you know, I say million. The United States spend $399 billion annually on military expenditure. Russia spends $65 billion, China spends 47 billion, and Japan spend 43 billion. Them is the World Cups, Chapter 6, the high price of militarism. Maintaining this huge military machine is not cheap. Every year, the U.S. spends hundreds of billions of dollars on the military. That is millions, billions. You can't even count the zero them. Since 1948, the U.S. has spent, listen to this. Listen to this. Talking about militarism, listen to this. Since 1948, the U.S. has spent more than 15 trillion. No, we're not, we passed billion. No, we passed billion, we got a trillion. Since 1948, the U.S. has spent more than $15 trillion to build up the military might. Just how much is 15 trillion worth? So they add up now. It adds up to more than the cumulative monetary value of all human-made wealth in the United States. This is what it adds up to. It adds up to more than the cumulative monetary value of all human-made wealth in the U.S. In other words, the United States government has spent more on the military over the last 4 decades than the value, listen to this. You talk about warmongering, listen to this. As I said, this book was not written by Al-Qaeda. This book was not written by any foreigner. It's American write this book. In other words, the government has spent, that is the United States government, has spent more on the military over the last 40 years than the value of all the factories, machinery, roads, bridges, water and sewage system, airports, railroads, power plants, office buildings, shopping centers, schools, hospitals, hotels, houses in this country put together. Let me read that again. The United States government has spent more on the military over the last 4 decades than the value of all the factories, machinery, road, bridges, water and sewage systems, airports, railroads, power plants, office buildings, shopping centers, schools, hospitals, hotels, houses in this country put together. If we add up the current Pentagon budget, the nuclear weapons budget of the Energy Department, the military portion of the NASA budget, foreign military aid, veterans benefits, interest payments and debt incurred by past military spending and military-related expenses, the U.S. spends over $776 billion a year to feed its addiction to war. That's more than $1 million a minute. That's more than $1 million a minute. This is to satisfy the addiction to war. This is the spending. And then them wonder why them can't, that's why them owe China $1 trillion. Oh, America owe China. That's weird. This costs you plenty. An average American household contributes over $4,400 in taxes every year to the cause of building up the world's most powerful military. Because Congress is so generous to the Pentagon, social programs get shortchanged. Bridges, roads, sewers, and water systems are crumbling because the government fails to provide money needed to maintain them. Bus fares are rising, and service is being slashed as the federal government has eliminated financial support for mass transit operating costs. Schools are run down and overcrowded in some inner city. They sound like a third world country they matter about, man. High schools, 80% of the students drop out. This sound like a third world country they matter about, man. 80% of the students are drop out. More than a fifth of all adults can't read a job application or a street sign. this was, you know, said that thing I did that well, what they call it, USA Today newspaper. More than a fifth of all adults in America can't read a job application or a street sign, yet federal education funding per student has declined substantially over the last 2 decades. Skyrocketing prices are causing a crisis in healthcare. 43 million people have no insurance and millions more have inadequate insurance. More and more people don't get the medical care they need because they can't afford it. Yet public hospitals are being closed and the government has failed to enact any serious health care reform. 1/5 of all listen to this, if this is not third world, what else? 1/5 of all expectant mothers do not receive prenatal care. This is one reason the U.S. has the highest infant mortality rate in the developed world, twice as high as Japan. Every 50 minutes a child in the U.S. dies as a result of poverty or hunger. This is not Africa we are talking about, this is America. Every 50 minutes a child in the U.S. dies as a result of poverty or hunger. And I was reading a statistics the one time where them say there are 20 million homeless people on the streets. Yet Congress has been exceedingly stingy in finding maternal and child aid programs. With rents rising and wages falling, millions of families are living on the verge of eviction. Millions of people end up living on the streets. Yet when it comes to funding for housing and homeless, most of Washington seems to have adopted Reagan's attitudes. Drug addiction and alcoholism are crippling millions of people and devastating families and whole communities. Yet there are not enough public treatment centers to handle even a fraction of these seeking help. And many centers are closing their doors for lack of funding. And somehow they come up with billions of dollars a year to operate 12 aircraft carrier battleships. This is serious. With the 1 billion it takes to maintain just one of these aircraft carriers, and this is about the aircraft carrier now, because them say it's paid billions of dollars a year to operate 12 aircraft carrier battle groups. With the 1 billion it takes to maintain just one of these carriers for a year, you could build 17,000 homes for 67,000 people. Or you could provide free prenatal care for 1,600,000 expectant mothers, saving thousands of babies. Or enroll 384,000 more kids in the Head Start free school program. Or provide intensive drug and alcohol treatment for 333,000 people with just this, where them use to make to maintain the aircraft. Or give 500,000 malnourished children in this country 3 meals a day for 1 year. Or you could put down a payment on a brand new aircraft carrier. Which is exactly what they are doing, building a new aircraft carrier. The government can find hundreds of billions for new aircraft carriers and other military hardware. But they say they can't find the money to deal with the pressing problems we face. The price of militarism includes more than high taxes and poor social services. Building nuclear weapons, for instance, has probably been the biggest environmental disaster this country has ever seen. More than 100 nuclear weapon plants owned by the Energy Department have been spewing radioactive waste into the air, dumping it in rivers and leaking it into the soil and groundwater for decades. The administrators who run the nuclear weapon plants have knowingly subjected the people who work in them and the people who live near them to deadly radioactive contamination without telling them a word about it. The government now estimates it will take 25,000 workers at least 30 years to clean up the mess at their plants at a cost of 300 million or more. What's more, nuclear weapon tests have spread deadly plutonium across large tracts of the Southwest and the South Pacific, Many of the 458,000 US soldiers who participated in the atomic test program are now dying of cancer. But they are not the only ones. High cancer rates plague the general population in the testing areas. One study estimated that previous nuclear testing could eventually cause at least 430,000 people to die of cancer worldwide. Meanwhile, at military bases around the country, they have been dumping hundreds of thousands of tons of toxic waste, including chemical warfare agents, napalm, explosive PCBs, and heavy metals, creating malignant lagoons and contaminating the groundwater of surrounding communities. There are 11,000 military dump sites that need to be cleaned up. The estimated cost is 100 to 200 billion. Another cause of the foreign wars is the retaliation they bring. On the eve of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Homeland Secretary Tom Ridge admitted that the war could spur more terrorist attacks against the U.S. In other words, the Bush administration knew that invading Iraq would bring retaliation, but it decided to go ahead and place us in greater danger anyway. The war on terrorism opened a new chapter in U.S. foreign wars, a chapter that may be marked by an endless cycle of violence. Some in Washington seem to relish the prospect. Emerging from his secret bunker several weeks after the September 11, 2001 attacks, Dick Cheney predicted that the war on terrorism would go on for a long time. As part of this endless war, he declared we have to be prepared for ongoing terrorist attacks. As a result, Cheney warned we'll have to get used to evasive security measures, which brings us to another cost of militarism, the loss of our civil rights. So, Homeland Security, them talk about. This is a serious thing. So, militarism and the media, last chapter, and how them use the media. Most Americans are not very eager to fight wars halfway around the world. In order to win public support, pro-war politicians have always had to wrap foreign wars up in red, white, and blue and tell Americans that it's their patriotic duty to support them. And we can remember Muhammad Ali, one of the most famous person who decided that him now go fight people who him don't know. And then it goes on, chapter 8, resisting militarism. So, we're not going to read no more, no. We're not going to read no more. It's almost done. I recommend that you go and get this book. I don't know where I'll get it, you know. Go up online. It's easy. Do something about it. And then it have, in the last part of the book, it tell you what you can do about it. What can we do about it? It offers some solutions. Addicted to war. Why the U.S. can't kick militarism. A very interesting but serious compilation of reasons given why America is continuously at war with people, and we still can't see no end to their proclamation that you have to fight wars to bring peace.
So my people, this one was indeed a warm one. So feel free to leave an honest comment down in the comment section. And also, your own opinion. And you don't know me there upon the Black Unity program. So feel free to leave a like and subscribe to this channel if you're new. Bless up to each and every one. Up until then, peace out. Adios.